Okay, well, we're continuing on in our examination of the prophecy of Isaiah. We're up to chapter 5. And as I mentioned in a previous video, I wrote a series of articles on Isaiah starting about 10 years ago. And I'm refreshing them, updating them, and adding these video commentaries to them. So if you're interested in that, ewatchman.com, there's a listing on the menu there, Isaiah, and that'll the most recent ones at the top of the page of that index are the ones that I'm updating. So anyway, in the 5th chapter, God gives an illustration of a vineyard. And he worked on it and rid it of stones. He planted choice red vines. He built a wine press. But it turned out it only produced wild grapes. How disappointing. Of course, God is not really talking about grapes, is he, or a vineyard. It's an illustration. And he gets to the point here in verse 3. And now, you inhabitants of Jerusalem and men of Judah, please judge between me and my vineyard. God is very polite, isn't he? Please. So anyway, he tells them, he said, what more could I have done that I haven't done? I wanted these red grapes and I got wild grapes. So now, please let me tell you what I will do to my vineyard. I will remove its hedge, and it will be burned down, and I will break down its stone wall, and it will be trampled on. Well, Jehovah's talking about Jerusalem, isn't he? It was his vineyard. He goes on to say he had hoped for the men of Judah are the plantation he was fond of. He kept hoping for justice. But look, there was injustice. For righteousness, but look, a cry of distress. So, how could the men of Jerusalem contradict that? They did not produce the fruitage that God intended. And so he wasn't going to, keep nurturing this vineyard that produced only wild grapes. He took down its hedge. In other words, he was no longer going to protect them from their enemies, and they would be trampled on. Well, Jehovah's Witnesses know the history a little bit. That Nebuchadnezzar came in and he destroyed Jerusalem. But Jesus, it was rebuilt, of course. And again, it fit into God's purpose to produce the Messiah. Jesus came to Jerusalem, hailed as the king, right at the end of his ministry, and he was put to death. And Jerusalem was destroyed again. But Jerusalem figures into prophecy at the return of Jesus, does it not? Jesus, in the 24th chapter of Matthew, and 13th chapter of Mark, and 21st chapter of Luke, Jesus spoke about Jerusalem during the conclusion and how it would be surrounded by offensive pointed stakes because it's time for meting out justice. And Jesus warned those, when you see this disgusting thing standing where it ought not, flee. Because Jerusalem will be trampled on by the nations. I won't go into all that. I've written and done other videos on that. But it is interesting that here in the 5th chapter of Isaiah, it uses that very same expression, that it will be trampled on. So anyway, we get the point. Then Jehovah, he goes into, this is interesting. He said, woe to those who drag along their guilt with ropes of deception, and their sin with wagon cords. Drag along their guilt with ropes of deception. Doesn't that really describe well how the governing body of Jehovah's Witnesses, they've practiced an enormous deception? There's no problem with child abuse, where in reality several tens of thousands of children have been sexually abused over the past few decades. And well, anyway. And of course, all tied into 1914, the organization is a spiritual paradise. Satan is out there. There's no evil within Jehovah's earthly organization. So, ropes of deception. And they say, this is interesting, let him speed up his work. Let it come quickly that we may see it. Let the purpose of the Holy One of Israel take place that we may know it. Isn't that Jehovah's Witnesses? It says in Amos, woe to those who are yearning for the day of Jehovah. Aren't Jehovah's Witnesses yearning for that? Come on, Armageddon, and wipe out Babylon the Great. Let's get on to the new system. That's what it's saying here in Isaiah. And woe to those who say, let him speed up his work. Let it come quickly that we may see it. So we're in the favored position, and all we're going to be, bystanders watching Jehovah destroy his enemies. And then he goes on to say, woe to those who say what is good is bad and bad is good, and those who substitute darkness for light and light for darkness. Woe to those who are wise in their own eyes and discreet in their own sight. The wise and faithful slave, they've already pronounced themselves, approved. Huh? Well, anyway, Jehovah says this is why his anger is burning against his people. And verse 26, he says he's raised up a signal to a distant nation, and he has whistled for them to come from the ends of the earth. That was Babylon back then. And look, they are coming very swiftly. None among them are tired or stumbling. No one is drowsy or sleeps. And goes on to say the hooves of their horses are like flint and their wheels like a storm wind, and their roaring is like that of a lion. They roar like young lions, and they growl and seize the prey and carry it off with no one to rescue. Well, reading over this, I was thinking how much like the prophecy of Joel. Of course, Jehovah said that these locusts were coming in, but he described them very similarly. He says, for a nation has come into my land, mighty and without number. Its teeth are the teeth of a lion, and its jaws are those of a lion. So he illustrates this, the multitude as being locusts, but here he describes them as, having the ferocity of a lion. Well, notice the next verse. This is Joel chapter 1, verse 7. It has devastated my vine, Jehovah's vineyard, and turned my fig tree into a stump, stripping them completely bare and tossing them aside, leaving their twigs white. Yeah, and go on down, verse 12. The vine has dried up, the fig tree has withered, the pomegranate, the palm, the apple, all the trees of the field have dried up. For joy has turned to shame among the people. Well, again, God's not talking about an orchard of any kind, is he? It is the end of the harvest, the end of the work that Christians were assigned to do. They're described as farmers and vine dressers out in Jehovah's vineyard, and in harmony with what we read there in Isaiah, the 5th chapter, Jehovah's going to have his vineyard destroyed. And that's why he tells his people to wail and weep. Well, it's interesting, I can navigate this thing here. So we know that Jerusalem was destroyed, and that's what it's illustrating in the book of Joel as well. But in the 3rd chapter of Joel, God goes on to say, and the people of Judah and Jerusalem you have sold to the Greeks. So Jehovah is coming to set matters straight. By the way, there and the closing verse in Isaiah, the 5th chapter, he says, in that day they will growl over it, these lions, like the growling of the sea, and anyone who gazes at the land will see distressing darkness. Even the light has grown dark because of the clouds. Well, it mentions a number of times in the book of Joel that preceding the day of Jehovah, there will be darkness and not light. For example, verse 15 in chapter 3, sun and moon will become dark and the stars will lose their brightness. And Jehovah will roar out of Zion, out of Jerusalem. He will raise his voice, and heaven and earth will rock. But Jehovah will be a refuge for his people, a fortress for the people of Israel. And then it says, you will have to know that I am Jehovah, your God, residing in Zion, my holy mountain. Jerusalem will become a holy place, and strangers will pass through her no more. Well, that couldn't have been said with the rebuilt Jerusalem. After the Jews came back from Babylon, they rebuilt Jerusalem, and strangers came through again, right? The Roman armies obliterated that city. But it's talking about Christ's congregation, which had its beginning in the ancient city of Jerusalem. And so that's Jehovah's earthly organization, which his vineyard, which he allows to be destroyed. So how is it that Jehovah roars out of Zion and then he protects Jerusalem and it becomes a holy place and strangers will no more pass through it? That's when the kingdom comes. Jehovah will be through with his earthly organization. The heavenly kingdom will be established, and those with faith enter into it, even on earth, and receive protection. And that's what all the prophecies tie in. That's how it works. Anyway, my back is killing me. I gotta go see a chiropractor later, and in a few minutes actually. Thanks for watching.